As we continue with our series of messages from the Gospel of Mark, I'd like for you to please open your Bibles once again to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1, and we're going to read verses 40 through 45. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony to them." However, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in deserted places. And they came to him from every direction. In our day and time, perhaps no disease is more feared and dreaded than cancer. Our prayer list in the bulletin each week is filled with the names of people who are battling this dreaded disease. And there's not one of us here this morning who does not know someone who either has battled or is currently battling cancer. And sadly, all of us knows someone or several someones whose lives were shortened by this awful dreaded disease. In Jesus' time, there was no disease more feared or dreaded than a disease called leprosy. There's a wonderful website called Bible History Online. And I would like to share with you some information that I found on this website about this dreadful disease of leprosy. The article says, during ancient biblical times, there was a loathsome disease called leprosy. In the Hebrew language, the word for leprosy was tazara, which means smitten, as in smitten by God. In the New Testament, the Greek word lepra means scaly. It was an uncontrollably slow-growing disease that would cause swollen lumps on the skin and ulcerous scabs all over the body. There was a numbness sensation that caused the leper to scratch himself and damage his body unknowingly. A leprous person would look scaly and very deformed. Their hair and body was noticeably white, and therefore the leper was easy to identify. Their bodies would rot. Body parts would deform. Their fingers, toes, and sometimes even their feet would fall off. The leper would drag himself along, and his voice would sound like a dog growling or howling in pain. The only hope for the leper was death. If you've ever done an in-depth study on this awful disease, you know that the physical suffering was actually only one aspect of it. There was also social and spiritual suffering. If one had leprosy, he or she was viewed by the public as stricken by God for his or her sins. And therefore lepers were considered outcasts. They were forced to leave their homes, leave their families, and leave their friends, and to go live in caves or in colonies with other lepers. They had to leave their heads uncovered and wear torn clothes, which was symbolic of lamenting their own death. If someone approached them, they had to put their hand or the sleeve of their garment over their mouth and shout, "Unclean, unclean," to warn the person to stay away. And other than those words of warning, a leper was not permitted to give or to receive a greeting. Because in the Eastern culture, greetings involved an embrace and a kiss on the cheeks. In biblical times, lepers would often live out their remaining days on earth with no family around them, no friends, no hope, no words of encouragement, and no warmth of a human touch or embrace, and they would die all alone. And so as we go back to our text here in Mark chapter 1, Jesus meets a man one day who is afflicted with this awful, dreaded disease. First of all, I would have you to notice the leper's cry. This is in verse 40. And I want you to pay particular attention to the pronoun him in verse 40. And him is referring to Jesus. The focal point is actually not the leper. The focal point is Jesus. Listen to what verse 40 says. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." You know, after teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum and healing multitudes of people, including Peter's mother-in-law, Jesus has now been going from city to city and village to village throughout Galilee, proclaiming the good news to huge crowds of people. Now, Mark doesn't tell us where Jesus is when this leper came to him. Luke's gospel tells us that this happened when Jesus was in a certain city. It doesn't specify where, though. And Matthew's gospel tells us there was a great multitude of people following Jesus at the time this leper came to him. And so picture this scene. Jesus is walking along, he's teaching this huge crowd of people, when all of a sudden there's a lot of commotion in the crowd. People are scattering. Parents are shielding the eyes of their children from looking upon the face of this grossly disfigured man. And many in the crowd are shouting their disgust as this leper makes his way through the crowd to get to Jesus. When the leper reaches Jesus, he kneels down before him, and in his eerie, gravelly voice, he cries out, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Is there anything more heartbreaking and gut-wrenching than a human cry of distress and desperation? You see, this is the cry of a man who's all alone in the world. He has no comfort from his family. He has no companionship with friends. There's no doctor who can heal him. There's no medicine to ease his pain. There's no hospital that can treat him. Jesus Christ is his only hope. His only hope. And so this leper throws himself upon the mercy of Christ and cries out, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." The leper knows that Jesus has the power and authority to heal him. Evidently, word has reached the leper colony of the things that Jesus has done, the healings that he has performed. And perhaps this leper has even lingered in the shadows and witnessed Jesus healing others. And so he knows Jesus is able to heal him. The only question the leper has in his mind is if Jesus is willing to do for him what he has done for others. And so he cries, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Next, we see the Lord's compassion. The The first part of verse 41 says, then Jesus moved with compassion. When the crowd saw this leper, they were moved with disgust. In the eyes of the crowd, the leper was a sickening sight, a repulsive sight, a disgusting sight, even a frightening sight. But contrast that with how Jesus saw the leper. Jesus was moved with compassion. You know, those words are spoken of Jesus several times in the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, when Jesus saw the huge crowd of sick and diseased people who were like sheep without a shepherd, that passage tells us he was moved with compassion for the people. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 14, when Jesus looked out across that crowd of 5,000 hungry people who had listened to him teach all day long and had gone without food, he was moved with compassion. In Mark chapter 5, we read about Jesus' encounter with the Gadarene demoniac who lived in a cemetery and still had the chains on him that people had shackled him with to try to subdue him. And verse 19 of Mark 5 tells us that Jesus had compassion on him. In Luke chapter 7, we read the account where Jesus was coming into that small Galilean town of Nain one day when he met a funeral procession coming out of town. The only son of one of the widow women in town had died. And when Jesus saw the unbearable grief in that widow's face over the loss of her son, verse 13 says, he had compassion on her. Jesus was constantly moved with compassion. Jesus moved towards people that other people moved away from. Jesus was drawn to those who disgusted others. Jesus felt our griefs. He took our sorrows and our sicknesses and our pain and our suffering upon himself. The tears of others brought him to tears. The hurts of others brought hurt to his heart. The cries of others reached down into the very depths of Jesus and moved him to offer whatever help he could render. And so when Jesus saw how leprosy had ravaged the face and body of this leper, and he heard his cry for help, Jesus was moved with compassion. Need I remind you this morning that this same Jesus has compassion for you and me. When you lost your mate and cried yourself to sleep night after night, Jesus was moved with compassion. When you sat by the bedside of your precious loved one in their final days here on earth, Jesus was moved with compassion. When your heart was broken by the cruel, hurtful words of your rebellious teenage son or daughter, Jesus was moved with compassion. When you have walked through the valley of grief, the valley of sorrow, the valley of loneliness, the valley of depression, the valley of failure, the valley of disappointment, Jesus was right there with you in the valley because he was moved with compassion. You have never shed a tear. You have never felt a pain. You have never cried out for help. You have never uttered a prayer of desperation. But what Jesus didn't know it and was moved with compassion. When that pitiful leper made his way through the crowd that day and cried, "If you are willing, you can make me clean," Jesus was moved with compassion. That man literally reached out and touched the heart of Jesus Christ. Next, we see the Lord's cure. Look again at verses 41 and 42. Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. You remember in last week's message when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law of her fever? I told you that Jesus performed that miracle with no fanfare, no drama, no theatrics. Well, Jesus uses that same soft, gentle, low-key approach in healing this leper. Mark simply says that Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. And in response to the leper's earlier cry, Jesus said, "I am willing. Be cleansed." And as soon as Jesus said those words, the man was immediately made whole. The scaly skin cleared up, every oozing scab disappeared, every missing finger, every missing toe reappeared. All the color came back into his bleached hair and skin. There wasn't one solitary shred of evidence that this man had ever even had leprosy. Whatever the man looked like before he got this disease, he now looked like again, and perhaps even better and healthier than before. Only Jesus can do that. Only Jesus can heal completely and restore us to wholeness. And that brings us to our fourth and final thought, and that is the Lord's command. Look again at verses 43 and 44. However, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter so that Jesus... Well, let me back up. I moved on ahead of myself here. Verse 43 and 44. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony." Jesus actually gave this leper two commands here. The command to go show himself to the priest served a twofold purpose. One physical and the other spiritual. According to the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 14, when one was cleansed of leprosy or any kind of a skin rash or skin disease, they were to go before the priest to be examined. That was the law. The priest, in essence, served as a doctor, in a sense. Only the priest could verify that the leprosy or that the skin disease was gone and could declare the man or woman whole. And once the man or woman was declared cleansed, they were then freed by the priest to go back and rejoin their family. And they were free once again to worship at the temple. You see, only the priest could pronounce this man physically and spiritually clean. And so, in keeping with the law, Jesus commanded the man to go show himself to the priest. Now, the other commandment that Jesus gave to this healed leper seems strange to us. Mark tells us that Jesus strictly warned this man not to say anything to anyone about how Jesus had healed him of his leprosy. Jesus didn't ask him not to tell anyone. Jesus didn't request that he not tell anyone. He strictly warned him not to tell anyone. The Greek vocabulary that is used here literally means Jesus snorted like a horse when he spoke these words. In other words, there was an undeniable sternness in Jesus' voice when he gave this command to the man. Now, why was Jesus so emphatic that this man keep his healing a secret? I mean, to us, it seems like Jesus would want him to go out and tell everybody about this great thing that had happened to him. But that was not the case. Jesus told him not to tell anybody. Why was Jesus so emphatic that he keep it a secret? It was because healing was not the focal point of his ministry. The focal point of his ministry was to preach and teach the good news of the kingdom. You see, Jesus had no interest in becoming a celebrity. He didn't want people viewing his ministry as some kind of a traveling sideshow. This would only obscure the true purpose of his ministry. And this is why Jesus commanded the man to tell no one. You see, Jesus didn't come here just to bring physical healing to the body. He came here to bring spiritual healing to the soul. He didn't come here to make sick people well. He came here to make spiritually dead people alive. Well, did the man listen to what Jesus told him? Of course not. The man didn't heed the warning at all. And to be honest, I doubt that we would have either. Verse 45 says, however, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter. That's just another way of saying he told every person he met about what Jesus had done for him. And sure enough, the very thing that Jesus was trying to avoid happened. People began to view him as Israel's most popular and famous celebrity. And the only way Jesus could avoid the crowds was to stay out of the cities and stay out in the desolate places. And Mark tells us there in that last verse that still people came from everywhere to see Jesus. Now, what does any of this have to do with us today? What does Jesus healing a leper 2,000 years ago have to do with us? Actually, it has a whole lot more to do with us than we think. You see, in the Scriptures, leprosy was much more than a dreaded physical disease. Leprosy symbolized sin and its deadly effects upon every man. You see, at one time, you and I were spiritual lepers. We don't like to think of it that way, but it's true. You and I were once spiritual lepers. Just like leprosy, sin started out small in our lives and it just continued to grow. Like leprosy, sin numbed our sensitivity to God. Like leprosy, sin marred and disfigured our lives. Like leprosy, sin rotted our minds and our hearts and our spirit. Like leprosy, sin damaged our relationships with our family and with our friends. And worst of all, like leprosy, sin made you and me unclean and separated us from God. Like filthy, rotten, wretched lepers, there was nothing that you and I could do to heal ourselves. We were vile, disgusting sinners who could only cry out to the Lord for mercy. The Lord had compassion on us. He reached out by His grace. He touched us. He cleansed us. And He made us whole. And the Lord is still touching lives today. No matter what you've done. No matter how bad you've been. No matter how miserably you have failed. No matter how numerous your sins may be. Jesus loves you. And Jesus has compassion on you. And Jesus wants to cleanse you and make you whole. The Lord is willing to heal you and cleanse you. The question is, are you willing to let Him? Are you willing to walk away from the life of sin and be cleansed and made whole by the touch of the Master's hand. Shackled by a heavy burden, beneath a load of guilt and shame, then the hand of Jesus touched me, and now I am no longer the same. Since I met this blessed Savior, since He cleansed and made me whole, I will never cease to praise Him. I'll shout it while eternity rolls. He touched me. Oh, He touched me. And oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I'm whole. He touched me and made me whole. Today, you need the touch of the Master's hand. You need to be cleansed and made whole again. Won't you come as we stand and as we sing our hymn of decision? Hymn number 332.